I'm sure you were like me this past Thursday afternoon when I heard the news that Queen Elizabeth had passed from this life into the presence of the Lord. A remarkable woman. Through the years, I've watched numerous documentaries and stories of her life and her reign. One that Grace and I watched, and I think there's still a season to come of it, called The Crown. Just it was amazing how it let you begin to see in the life of this person who never should have been the queen if her uncle had done what he was supposed to do, but he didn't. And then her dad was a man who nobody thought could be the king. He had challenges with his speech. He was an introvert. He had all kinds of health issues. But God knew what he's doing. God raises kings up and he takes kings down. And God knew that being raised in that home was this little girl called Elizabeth, who was going to become the most renowned, longest reigning monarch of Great Britain. And just so you know, she really is the longest reigning monarch of the world. King Louis XIV actually had more years of being designated as king, but that was when he was a child, and for a number of those years, his mother was actually the one who had the authority. So for him to actually become the reigning king, there were several years that passed, and if you take those years away, Queen Elizabeth actually ruled longer than he did. And I think somebody ought to straighten the record on that. And it is, if you go read, you'll read deep enough, you'll find that is truth. But here this woman, all those years of living out who she was supposed to be. And it's just amazing. In her reign as queen, we had 14 different presidents. In America, if you don't like this president, just wait a few years, there's another one coming. Only one of those presidents that didn't meet her was Lyndon Johnson. The rest of them all had opportunity to, at some point in their presidency, actually have an audience with the Queen. She actually had 15 different prime ministers. And the great statesman Winston Churchill was the prime minister when she became queen. And just 2 days before her death, Liz Truss, I believe is how you say her name, was just anointed by her as the new Prime Minister of England. Can you imagine how she must feel to know that she was probably in the last official pictures that were taken with the Queen? And then just a couple of days later, she slipped into the presence of God. If you read about her, you'll find that even as a child and young woman, she saw what she was to do as queen as being a divine appointment. She did not see it as just a matter of happenstance. She really believed that God had ordained her and called her, and that it was assignment from God for her to be the queen. And there's been enough statements that have been made that I believe she understood what it was to have a personal relationship with Jesus. And so she lived all those years. She navigated tough waters. Any of you remember Princess Di? Ma'am, what a soap opera. Prince Charles, Di, Camille, the Young and Restless, right there in England. And yet, through the tragedy of Princess Di's death, Elizabeth turned what was a disaster for their family into a time where the monarchy was redefined and reestablished and reconfirmed because of how she led and what she said. Her words that she spoke, she knew carried power. And she was determined to always use those words in a wise way. And so the family navigated to such a point that if you would have said at the time that all of that mess was going on, that Charles would really live to be king, most people would have thought can't be, just because of all the turmoil surrounding his personal life. And now he is the King of England. And I think he probably knows it. He owes it all to his mother for what she did in understanding how to speak things into being. And I thought it interesting that in his first public speech, he acknowledged his son, Harry, and his movie star wife, Meghan. There may be hope that that family will still be able to come back together again. And I think that's part of the legacy of Queen Elizabeth. But it's the power of spoken word. And we understand their royalty. And if a king says this is how it is, that's how it is. It's made to happen. But you know, things like I just described, I don't care who you are and what you say, they don't just happen because she was a queen. They happen because she spoke with conviction and authority that what she was saying was what needed to be, and so she exercised being able to speak that which is not as though it were. And I do believe that she did have strong personal faith. Her Christmas message 2002, she said this: I know just how much I rely on my own faith to guide me through the good times and the bad. Each day is a new beginning. I know that the only way to live my life is to try to do what is right, to take the long view, to give of my best in all the day brings, and to put my trust in God. Like others of you who draw inspiration from your own faith, I draw strength from the message of hope in the Christian gospel. There's another powerful truth being spoken by an influential woman that changed her country and ultimately the world. I think it's so important that you and I understand something. If earthly royalty has power in their spoken word, how much more does divine royalty? We sing a lot of songs about being a child of the King. But I guess the reality is, do you understand you are a child of the King if you're a believer in Jesus? And if you want to talk about the longest reigning king, he was reigning when you started counting time. And he's still going to be reigning when we quit counting time, because he reigns eternally. He is an eternal God. And so when you and I begin to understand that, we begin to recognize the power of the eternity of our God, and that you and I are called to the destiny of being his children. We've been for these last several weeks talking about these basic principles that are biblical principles for living. And today we're going to talk about speak to the mountain. I want to read a very familiar passage of Scripture as kind of our text for what we're going to talk about today. Mark chapter 11, verse 22. Let the faith of God be in you. Listen to the truth I speak to you. Whoever says to this mountain with great faith and does not doubt, mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the midst of the sea, and believes what he says will happen, it might be done. What? What? Really? I thought sometimes it didn't happen. Why do we live like that? Tell me one more time. What does it say? Will. All right, you got it. This is the reason I urge you to boldly believe, for whatever you ask for in prayer, be convinced that you have received it and it will be yours. You know what the enemy has done to the church? He's convinced us that it's humility to say, "Oh, mighty God, thou who's created the universe and has looked down on this thy lowly servant and had mercy if thou wouldst hear my humble plea, and if thou wouldst somewhere in thy great providence choose to meet this need within my life, I would be so grateful. However, not my will, but thine be done. And I think God stands in heaven and says to an angel, just go slap them. Because that is such a prayer of unbelief. And we tout it as spiritual in the religious world because it sounds religious. Thank God that He's delivered us from King James English. Those of you who believe the King James Bible is the one that Jesus read, get over it. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's not who you worship. It's a translation that God used a very ungodly king to have produced. And thank God for that. But there's some wonderful translations that are a lot easier to understand. And at least upgrade to the New King James Version. It's pretty good. Amen. Now that I wandered off on that little trail, I want to talk about what does it look like to speak to the mountain. It comes as we begin to embrace the faith of God. The Bible tells us that every person's been given the measure of faith. You have faith at work in your life, whether you're a believer or not, because literally when you sat down in the chair, you believed it would hold you or you wouldn't have sat down. Now, along the course of life, somewhere you've been disappointed when you sit down in a chair. We probably all somewhere had a chair that went out from under us. But you still come back and sit in a chair again because, you know, most of the time the predictability is that the chair is going to hold you up, so you believe that. But there is a faith that is the faith God's talking about that's been given as a measure, and that's the faith of God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3 states it this way in the Amplified. By faith, that is, with an inherent trust and enduring confidence in the power, wisdom, and goodness of God, we understand the worlds, the universe, the ages were framed and created. They were formed, put in order, and equipped for their intended purpose by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. It's important that you and I understand this. The operating system for God's creative action is faith. And here's the good news. God has it over iPhones and iPads and whatever. You do not ever need to update the operating system. Furthermore, we aren't going to, in a couple of years, have a new operating system because the operating system of God is timeless. The Word of God never changes. It's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that is really the creative action of faith, is the operating system for God. The Word of God provides a foundation for us that everything we do, every part of our lives, every dimension of who we are, comes out of this operating system of faith. And your relationship with God, you live, the Bible says, the just shall live by faith. And so it is the very basis for our lives as believers. And it's important to know this. It always originates and it always aligns with the Word of God. If you have faith that is God's faith, it comes from you having the Word of God made alive in you. I frequently talk about the difference between the Logos Word, the Rhema Word, and the Living Word, and they're all the same thing. But when you begin to understand that out of that understanding is the very essence of life, that changes everything for us. Because that lets us know that if it's in the Word of God, you and I can take it to the bank. It's true. We can count on it. And we can align our life totally with the Word of God. And the ultimate expression of that is when we bring Jesus into our hearts, and now we begin to live from the very life of Christ, who is that living Word of God. So the Word of God is inside of you if you're a believer. And then what we begin to understand is that hope is impregnated with the substance of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. In other words, our hope that is eternal is not just, oh, I really wish this could happen. Have you ever hoped for things that there was no way they were going to happen? That you just were hoping that this could be, and yet the reality was that whatever it was you were hoping for, there wasn't a chance that there would ever be anything like that happen. Have you ever had that kind of hope that got dashed? But when you hope in God, that hope is made pregnant by faith. Faith is a substance of things hoped for. And that means that that hope can become living reality. It's organic faith. It's not just something that we hang on the wall. It's not just something we talk about. It is a reality that comes true within our lives. And when it becomes impregnated with the substance of faith, doubt is obliterated. You know how you can know that you're really believing something? Is because doubt no longer has place for you. The story goes that one time Smith Wigglesworth, the great minister from nearly 100 years ago, walked out on his front porch one day. And when he walked out on the front porch, there was literally a personification of Satan sitting in his rocking chair rocking. And the story goes that Smith Wigglesworth just looked and went, "Oh, it's just you," and walked back in the house. God help us to become people who don't just live in the realm of the edge of faith through hope, but that our hope begins to take on the substance of faith that becomes so strong that no matter what, we know whom we've believed. We're persuaded that He's able to keep that which we've committed into Him against the day when Jesus is coming again. And that we live so powerfully in that hope that literally there's no room for doubt. It's just impossible. I still can't imagine what it must have been like when Abraham fully realized that Sarah was going to have a baby. And they would go to Wednesday night prayer meeting. They still had those in those days. And they would go to Wednesday night prayer meeting, and Abraham would say, "I'm just so thankful that Sarah's carrying the promise of God of my son." And people were going, "Oh, dear God, dementia is really taking over." There was no dementia when Isaac was born, was there? He knew that he knew that he knew. He had become persuaded. And the hope that he had carried for 25 years now was a living reality inside of Sarah's womb. And before long, it became a bump that was obvious. And then here was this baby that Sarah and Abraham had been trusted by God with when she was 90 and Abraham was 100. I'm going to tell you something. I'm not that old yet. But I want to tell you something. I'm not hoping to believe that Grace and I are going to have a child. We love our grandchildren. But I'm going to tell you, when God does something, impossible becomes probable. It's just what God does. And when we begin to understand that, then what happens is we can begin to trust God and to know this in the spiritual dimension of life. You and I are created bigger than this earthly existence. Oh, this is so important to get this morning. The reason we're so obsessed with the superheroes, the reason we love Marvel, the reason that we like to hear about all the superheroes that can do all these things is because it is a version that is impossible in the natural, but it really is stirring inside of us who we really are. Because the truth of the matter is this: that is who we really are. We just watched one the other night. What was the name of that? Was Sylvester Stallone in it? What? Samaritan. We just watched that one, and it kind of cool. Well, I can't tell you because they'd mess it up for you if you haven't seen it. But the truth is, the reason you start getting excited when you start watching those is if you're a believer, it's a reminder of who you really are. Because you have superhuman power that's not really human. The only reason it's human is because Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. And that released the power of God into humanity. And if you're a believer, the Son of God / Son of Man is in here. There is a big J on your chest. And it empowers us to be who we are so that we understand what Hebrews said, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Whatever that you want God to do, don't look at the visible to see where it's going to come from. Because it's going to come from the invisible. It's going to come from, I can't explain that except I just know it happened. I don't know what to say. That's why doctors get amazed when believers get healed. Because they don't know how to explain it in the natural because it's not explainable. All they know is the body that they had tests from that said one thing, now say something else. So that what was not visible was still alive. And the invisible turns into the world of the visible. And that's who you are. Want that to soak in. It's not something we just believe for. That is who you are. That's what's resident inside of you. And so we have to look and see in this world, that all sounds good. And you're rocking along and today you feel really good. And somewhere Tuesday or Wednesday this week, you're going to hit a brick wall. Because the real world is still out there, isn't it? And what happens is there are obstacles. We have a tree right by the corner of our house that I can walk under, and sometimes I'll walk under it when I'm working out in the yard just so I don't have to go around it. But every once in a while I'll forget that the branches are just about here. And so if I just slightly duck or I just move just a little bit, I'm fine. But every once in a while, I'll hit that branch and I say, praise the Lord, or something like that. But it just is an immediate touch of reality that there was an obstacle in the clear path I was walking through. But you and I need to understand this. There are going to be obstacles to your faith walking. There are going to be mountains that are going to seem impossible that are going to be in front of you. But here's a truth that you need to not ever forget. 1 Corinthians 10:13, again the Amplified. I like the Amplified because it takes a whole wheelbarrow full of words to say everything you need to hear. No temptation, regardless of its source, has overtaken or enticed you that is not common to human experience, nor is any temptation unusual or beyond human resistance. But God is faithful to His word. He is compassionate and trustworthy, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability to resist. But along with the temptation, He has in the past and is now and will always, I want you to hear that, along with the temptation, He has in the past and is now and will always provide the way out as well, so that you will be able to endure it without yielding and will overcome temptation with joy. If you've been a believer any length of time, you have stories of how God's done things in your life that you can't explain except God did them. The challenge is that in addition to those stories, right now there's things that are in front of you that seem bigger than you. And at times, if you're not putting your faith in the right place, they seem bigger than God. And it's so important that we come back and understand this. Whatever the current looming obstacle is that's in front of you, whatever the things are that are making you question, any of those things, whatever they are common. They're mundane. In other words, they're ordinary. They really aren't anything to be impressed by. So it looks really big to you right now. Begin to look at it and understand it's common. The enemy has no real creative power. All he has is the ability to repeat all the obnoxious things he's been doing for a long time. He just keeps practicing what he did in the Garden of Eden because it worked. And he wants to see if we're going to pull an Adam and Eve, or if we're going to represent the new Adam, Jesus. Have we had an encounter so that we're not going to do the dumb thing that Adam and Eve did in the garden? Because that's what he does. He keeps pulling over and over the same things. He even tried to do it with Jesus, the very Son of God, when he was on earth as a Son of Man. He basically tried to tempt Jesus with things that he really acted like Jesus wasn't God. And what did Jesus keep saying to him? It is written. And here's where Satan's kind of dense. He didn't realize that he was talking to the "it is written." Jesus wasn't just quoting Scripture. Jesus was Scripture. Jesus was basically saying, in your face, I am the Word of God. We sometimes look and say, oh, isn't it great that Jesus knew the Word? Well, he was the Word. And so when he looked at Satan, he was basically saying to him, get behind me, my power is far greater than yours. When he was saying it is written, he wasn't doing some kind of just little testimony of hopeful faith. He was just declaring who he is. And he's inside of you. So why in the world, when you're starting to get hit by Satan, and really it's not even Satan. You've heard me say this, and I say it because I want you to hear it and understand it. Satan probably doesn't know your name because he can only be in one place at a time. There's some little imp that probably looks a lot like E.T. that's been assigned to you. And just this little obnoxious creature, that's some little demon power who knows how to yell. And he has an awful voice. I actually watched some kind of a fashion show with Grace the other night. I'm a good husband. And there was this young boy that was a contestant. And I just wanted to slap him every time he opened his mouth to talk because his voice was so obnoxious. And that's the same kind of demonic little voice that the enemy has that he tries to destroy you with. And we go, oh, I'm so scared. Because we forget who we are. And we don't recognize who he is. You and I have to see it as common. And then the next thing you have to see is the faithfulness of God is far greater than the prowess of Satan or his demonic powers. God has been faithful to me. When I look back over these years at the faithfulness of God and the times when I so didn't deserve it, but God was still faithful to me. And he's faithful to every believer. You've got to begin to truly believe this, church. God has got you. Whatever it is that's overwhelming you now, quit looking at the overwhelming and recognize who's holding you in his hands. I want to tell you something. You're in a lot better hands than Allstate. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is your insurance. He's your provider. He's your Jehovah Jireh. He's more than enough. And he's holding you so that when you need to resist the devil, you're able to resist him from inside of God's hand. You're like the little kid who's being tormented by a bully, and all of a sudden his big brother shows up. And that little kid's right behind the big brother going, yeah! Your big brother's in front of you. Quit letting the bully intimidate you. Quit letting him control your emotions. Determine with God's help that you're going to stand up and you're going to resist the enemy. And I read in a book somewhere, when you do, he flees. And not only resisting, but overcoming. You're not called to just survival. You're called to overcome. You are going to triumph whatever the battle is that you are fighting. You will triumph. 96 years old, Queen Elizabeth's body was worn out. But I'm going to tell you something. The moment she breathed her last breath, she walked into eternity, and she walked in not as the Queen of England. She walked in as a princess of the eternal King of Kings, Lord of Lords. And she wouldn't come back. I remember another quote from her that she said one time, I hope Jesus comes back in my lifetime, because I would love to lay my crown at his feet. She got it. And I'm going to tell you, she did it just a few days ago. God, help us to know that we are called to be more than conquerors. We're called to victory. And here's what happens, is when you begin to walk in endurance. Now, please understand this. Survival and endurance are not the same words. Survival is mean that somehow I look awful beat up, but I'm still breathing. Endurance means that I'm the athlete, I'm the marathon runner, I'm the triathlon champion. And yes, I may have put out all kinds of effort, and there may be part of me that's exhausted. But in that marathon, when the point feels like I can't go over, all of a sudden I get a second wind, and I'm able to run the distance and be in triumph at the end. You are a marathon runner for God, and you're called not to survival, you're called to endurance. And there is an adrenaline that's greater than any drug man has ever had, or anything that this body can create in itself. It is spiritual adrenaline. And there is something that happens when the adrenaline of God kicks in inside of us, because it doesn't kick in just in our body, it kicks in our spirit. And when our spirit is made fresh and alive, the body doesn't have a choice but to follow it. And it empowers your body, your mind, your emotions, so that now with that spiritual adrenaline flowing, you are able to not just read 1 Corinthians 10:13, you live it. So that what happens at the very end, he says, and will overcome temptation with joy. Joy is not just feeling good. Joy is that sense that's greater than just emotion, that eventually will overwhelm you if you begin to let God bring it into your heart. And joy that begins to be released as you are enduring. It is that adrenaline. And it becomes a prophetic celebration. The joy is saying, I've already won. I've read the end of the book. And even though right now I'm in the middle of this marathon, I've already won. There's no question where the end's going to come, so that by the time you get to the end is just a culmination of the joy that's been happening along the journey. I want to tell you something. It's time for the Church of Jesus Christ to get this message. This message is not what I thought, or not something that I conjured up so I'd have a sermon today. This is the truth of God's Word that He wants us to live by. And you and I live in challenging times in the natural. We live in times where we struggle with what our world is doing. And if you read the news, sometimes you're just going, dear God, why is it that what used to be right is now considered wrong? And what used to be considered wrong is now being right. Should you be shocked? That started in the Garden of Eden. Satan started lying to Adam and Eve then, and they started buying into it. So why should we be shocked that Adam and Eve's all over our world are still buying into the lies and baking apple pies that are ungodly? Listen, you and I are not called to be determined by this world. We're called to live into a higher calling. And in the midst of a world that on the surface looks like it's going to hell, you and I are called to live the power of God and to trust that He is going to see us through. So that no matter what, we're going to win. We're going to be more than conquerors. And when we begin to think that way, it's going to change. Now, here is what's so important, is speaking to the mountain and understand the components of that speaking. I'm going to tell you something. The enemy's always trying to undermine truth that will change your life. And one of the greatest things the enemy has done since back in the 80s when the confession movement began to rise up. And understand, the very fact that it's been labeled as a confession movement tells you that it's man thinking, not God thinking. It's based in God's truth, but it began to be what became known in jargon as name it and claim it. And a lot of especially charismatic Pentecostal Christians got caught in the fallacy that the enemy used to try to discredit the truth. But I'm here to tell you this morning the truth was real. The fallacy was in how it got twisted. The truth is that we have to speak creatively from the Word of God, out of the Word of God that's inside us, because that's how God's always done things from when He began creating the world. And that when we begin to understand that, it is important what we speak. And we do need to guard our tongues. And we do have the ability to speak into existence things as though they are not, as though they were. Now the challenge is this. What the enemy taught us to do in the faith movement is this. You're sitting there with a raging fever and you say, I'm not sick, these are lying symptoms. And the enemy's he's just laughing all the way to the bank. Here's the true confession. Right now, my body is experiencing sickness and my body is in the natural world. But I have living inside of me the Son of God, Son of Man, who was fully God and yet came and was tempted every way as I was tempted and went to the cross. And when He went to the cross, this sickness that's been manifesting in my body, the price for it was paid in His death, burial, and resurrection. And that resurrection power is inside of me. So this sickness doesn't have the right to stay in this body. By the stripes of Jesus, I am healed. There's the correct confession. You say, well, it's the same thing. No, it isn't. And that's where the enemy messed us up. He got us to say things that sounded good and became rhetoric instead of declaring the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. And it's time for us to begin to speak truth. Proverbs 18, verse 21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it and indulge it will eat its fruit and bear the consequences of their words. Now, there's three aspects of speaking to the mountain that I want you to hear today. The first of those is to call forth. In other words, when you look and there's something that you believe God's wanting to do, but you can't see it right now, you begin to, in faith, call it forth. You begin to declare, by the power of God vested in me, I believe that this is going to happen, and it's in line with the Word of God and what God has put in my heart, and so I speak it into existence. Now, where did you learn that from? Well, I believe that's how you got here. God said, let us make man in our own image. And then He created us. God spoke the world into existence. He called it forth. And then there's another aspect of this. And that is to command. In other words, take authority. How much of our prayer life is, oh God, would you please? And if it is something that we haven't been given authority over, that's a good prayer. But if it's something we have been given authority over, you might as well just cuss. Not really. But if you've been given authority, why are you asking God something He already told you to do? He's given you dominion. He's given you dominion over the earth. And your bodies are made out of the dirt of this earth. And so you have authority over your body. You have authority over your mind. You have authority over your circumstances. If you're a parent, you have authority over your children. You have an authority in this nation. You have an authority in this world. And it's time that the Church of Jesus Christ begin to command the things of God and declare them to be. And that's the last one, is that as you command, you begin to declare. You proclaim the manifestation of what the completed expectation is going to be. You've heard this come out of my mouth a few times, and the pan is still sitting in my office. We will burn the mortgage on this church. I'm going to tell you, God may miraculously send somebody who isn't here to do it. But here's another prayer I want to challenge you to begin to pray, and this is one to ask God. God, what do you want me to do about it? Are you sitting on money that God intends to pay the mortgage with, and you're doing other things with it? It's not your money, it's God's. And if He's planning for you to use it for that, you need to ask Him how much He wants. It's sure quiet. Do you understand what I'm saying? Boy, it's time that we just declare what God wants to do and then make ourselves available for whatever part of it He wants to do through us. And then what happens is then prophetic declaration becomes a way of life. Begins to be how we live. John 14, verse 12. We read this and it sounds so poetic because it's part of that whole love chapter of Jesus where He says, I'm going and I'll bring you to me. And then we get into chapter 15, you're the vine, you're the branches. And we just like to read that because it sounds so good. But it wasn't meant to just sound good, it's truth. 14:12, I tell you this timeless truth. The person who follows me in faith, believing in me, will do the same mighty miracles that I do, even greater miracles than these, because I go to be with my Father. For I will do whatever you ask me to do when you ask me in my name. And that is how the Son will show what the Father is really like and bring glory to Him. Ask me anything in my name and I might do it. What? What? Man, you're right. That's what it says. You mean when I'm kind of waffling, I quit reading? Or when I'm reading, I quit believing? What does it say? I will. Here's the thing to recognize. Adversity is going to come in this world. It isn't that when we become a believer that suddenly we get insulated from adversity. As a matter of fact, when adversity comes, you need to recognize this. It's actually the perfect atmosphere for prophetic transformation to take place. We don't need prophetic transformation if everything's cool and going smooth. If you're in adversity right now, you are in the very place of atmosphere that can release the greatest power of God as you begin to prophetically declare the truth of God. What happens is we begin to speak in the natural from the indwelling Spirit, and that aligns the natural with the spiritual. The natural is in disalignment with the spiritual after what happened in the garden. Jesus brought it back into alignment, but He didn't force that on us. We still have to choose it to be reality in our lives. Otherwise, we're still in this natural world where it's not in alignment. But what happens is when you and I begin to understand that when we speak into the natural from the indwelling Spirit in us, so it's not just me talking off the top of my head. It's not me just repeating the platitudes I heard in church. It's me having a living reality of what's inside of me that I declare out of the Spirit of God that's in my spirit. And as that happens, the natural then has to align with the spiritual. I don't care if it takes 30 years. You keep speaking to it. You keep speaking to the mountain. And let me just give you some powerful illustrations of prophetic declarations since the beginning. Well, it starts out with God speaking the world into existence. We've already talked about that. Another great example is when Joshua, you remember when he commanded the sun and moon to stand still? And you say, yeah, but we know now that the sun stands still all the time. Hey, that's even a bigger miracle. Because that meant the earth had to stand still. But it did. Remember David? This kid, very probably the illegitimate son of Jesse. That's why his older brothers didn't like him. He didn't have the same mother they did. And here he was, this little boy who had been out in the shepherd field, and he's probably... By this time, he's a teenager, and his brothers are off in the army. Goliath's intimidating Saul and all the army every day. And David comes, and he says, why is he intimidating the army of God? David would have real fun in the church of today. He'd walk in and say to us, what's the problem? Why are you letting the Goliaths of this world rule how you function? And so what did he do? He finally convinced Saul to keep his armor. He didn't need it. And instead, he walks up and here's this big giant, 9 feet tall, standing in front of this little boy that's probably 5'8". And he starts talking to him. And he basically looks at him and he says, you uncircumcised Philistine. He just called it like it was. And he began to tell him what's going to happen to him. This is what's getting ready to happen. And everybody's going, what? Because this kid's standing there with a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. 4 of them are overload. They're overkill. He's just going to need 1. And see what nobody's bothered to calculate. When God equips you, he takes what may seem so small in the face of what seems so large. And he can take what seems so small and powerfully obliterate what's so large. Because it never dawned on Goliath. I believe even when he was swinging the slingshot around, I don't think it ever dawned on Goliath what was getting ready to hit him. And all of a sudden, this little bitty stone knocked the giant down. And if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, then you can speak to the mountain, and the mountain has no choice but to be cast in the sea. Are you loading up your slingshot for whatever the enemy's been after you? And here's that 9-foot giant in front of you. But oh, in the past, you've killed a bear or a lion with that slingshot. You've already faced smaller giants. Now the big one's in front of you. But the same power of the same God that's resident in you, when the velocity of that stone gets turned loose, it's going to have the same effect on the biggest giant that it did on the smallest one. And when you and I begin to understand that, then the enemy has nothing he can do. And then Jesus himself, he hasn't yet been crucified and resurrected. And he goes to Lazarus' tomb. And he says to him, come forth. And you know what? He said, Lazarus, come forth. You know why that's important? If he hadn't said, Lazarus, come forth, every dead person within the sound of his voice would have been coming forward. Because that's how powerful he is. But he was specific to Lazarus as who needs to come forth. And he raised him from the dead. He spoke to the mountain. I really believe that's God what wants us to do. I need 3 more minutes Can I have 3 more minutes? Raise your hand if I can have 3 more minutes. Well, there's 45 minutes. Thank you. No, I really want this to soak in. I don't know if you can tell this, but I'm pretty passionate about what I'm talking to you about. And I just thought, and Grace and I were talking, when she first came to me about this series of biblical principles for living and we began to talk about it, it just began to stir. But as it's gone and as God has built it in both of us over these last few weeks, it's just been so obvious to us how important this series is. And here's the deal. It all sounds simple. These are all basic truths. All 5 of these principles are basic principles. You know, one thing that's been wrong ever since cassette tape recorders and the charismatic movement, and we started taping messages so people could go play them all week long and listen to them again. I'm not knocking that. That's okay. And you probably should go back. I'm getting ready to tell you to do that. Sound like a hypocrite now, don't I? But here's the problem that has happened. We have this desire to know more things. That's why people, if they hear someone who's had prophetic ministry, they run to wherever they're going to be holding a meeting. And I'm going to tell you something, a lot of prophets are only about half right half the time. So if you're chasing them, you're not chasing the right thing. Doesn't mean God doesn't ever speak through them, but you need to hear from God, not some prophet. And when you begin to open your heart to God, till you and I learn to live these truths we've talked about in these 5 weeks, greater, deeper truth is going to be meaningless. So what I challenge you is you don't need a cassette recorder because it's going to be on our website. But I would challenge you for the next 5 weeks to each week concentrate on one of these. Build your house on the rock. Then spend a week really meditating on sowing and reaping. A week on the golden rule, a week on honoring your parents, and a week speaking to the mountain. And watch and see what God's going to do in you. Why do I think that's so important? Because I really believe LifeBridge is at a threshold of the greatest opportunities we've ever had to be what God wants us to be. I'm excited about what God has in store. I'm looking so forward to Joe and Becca coming to join us. But I got to tell you, Joe and Becca aren't going to bring to LifeBridge what we've got to have. They're going to come be a part of it. And if you and I don't do what we're supposed to do, we could have 10 Joe and Beccas come and join us and it wouldn't change things. And that's not taking anything from the value of what they're going to bring to this church family. What I'm telling you is it's a partnership. And God wants to raise this church up as a multi-generational church that's going to change the city of Fort Wayne and going to change the world. And I'm going to do what I've been preaching to you this morning. I'm getting ready to speak to the mountain and declare to you a prophetic word that Pat Roberts sent to me yesterday that I believe is a word for this church today, that as we declare it this morning, we are calling it forth. We're commanding everything that opposes it, and we're going to speak to the mountain of obstacle that's held us back as a church, and we're going to see mighty things for the glory of God. Here's the word. I have given America a new destiny that will break generational chains that have held people captive for multiple generations. A fresh wind is blowing to clear away the fog of doubt and unbelief in my house. When the King of Glory enters in, the enemy's plans are dismantled and destroyed. I have already begun to bring a new thing into LifeBridge as my people are hungry for spiritual freedom. No more pablum, but now I'm bringing fresh meat to my lines who have cried out for the real deal to be available to all who have cried out for more. Now I say to LifeBridge, get ready for the boat-rocking, hell-shaking faith that cries out, come alive, dry bones, and watch the false gods and people crumble as they hear Jesus is Lord over his house. And the demons shall flee as my spirit comes in with power and might. Masks are being ripped off to show those who really belong to my family. I will now flow as the floodgates have been opened for the desperate and the hungry, the weak and the feeble, and the true lovers of God. Make room for the glory, says God, as I'm taking this body to a whole new level of believing and seeing the impact upon lives. Get hungry for the real meat of my word as I'm going to now feed my lines the raw truth so that they can be the bold and courageous that follow the bloodline of Pastor past generations. I will overwhelm my lovers so they can walk, live, and move in me. Great and amazing days are now here. Ask of me, and I will give you the kingdom, says God. No more stepchildren, but my children who believe in me. Do you believe that? Stand and give an ovation to the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He is the God of this house. He's the Lord of our lives. And we are going to speak to the mountains in our individual lives. We're going to speak to the mountains that stand in front of us as a church. And we're going to watch the glory of God in this church, in this city, and in our world. Amen? Amen. Amen.